Let me tell you about the quietest sound in the world. It's not the absence of noise. It's the sound of a space where someone should be. That sound filled the oak-paneled courtroom in Oak Creek, Wisconsin on the day of the sentencing. For David and Helen Miller, it was the only sound they could hear. They sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table. And next to Helen, between her and her husband, was an empty chair. It wasn't just an empty chair. It was a void. A black hole. That was where their daughter, Chloe, should have been sitting. She would have been 18 that day. She would have been nervous, maybe holding her mom's hand, dressed in something bright and hopeful. But Chloe wasn't there. She would never be in any chair, ever again. And every single person in that room knew it. Across the aisle, the air was different. It was charged with a different kind of energy. Tense, sure, but also impatient. That's where 18-year-old Jason Thorne sat, flanked by his high-priced lawyer. Jason was clean-cut, wearing a suit that probably cost more than David Miller's first car. He looked down at his hands, then around the room, his posture relaxed, almost bored. He didn't glance at the Millers. He never did. To him, they were just part of the depressing furniture of this whole miserable proceeding. And then there was the judge. Judge Harold Bennett. He was a large man, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and a reputation for having no patience for nonsense. When he walked in, and the bailiff called the room to order, his eyes did a slow sweep of the room. They lingered on the Millers, their grief a palpable cloud around them. They moved to Jason, taking in his detached expression. You could see the judge filing it all away, weighing it. The prosecutor stood up. His voice was soft, but it cut through the quiet. Your Honor, today we are here to sentence the young man who took Chloe Miller's life. But we are also here to acknowledge the life that was taken. He spoke about a scholarship, about a future in veterinary medicine, about a girl who volunteered at animal shelters. With every word, that empty chair between David and Helen seemed to grow larger, screaming in its silence. And Jason Thorne? He shifted in his seat, let out a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh, and checked the clock on the wall. If the sound of your own child's voice can send a chill down your spine, stay tuned. What I'm about to tell you next will change the way you listen to the silence in your own home. You see, a courtroom can tell you about a crime. It can list charges and present evidence. But it can't truly measure a life. It can't capture the sound of a laugh, or the light in someone's eyes. That's what the next part of the hearing was for. It was called the Victim Impact Statement. And it was the moment the Millers had to try and pour their ocean of grief into a small, legal-sized cup. Helen Miller was the first to stand. Her hands trembled as she held a single piece of paper. Her voice was so soft, the judge had to lean forward to hear her. "Chloe," she began, and then stopped, closing her eyes for a second. Chloe played the piano. Not perfectly, but beautifully. She'd practice after school, and the whole house would fill with this music. Sometimes it was clumsy, sometimes it was brilliant. I used to get annoyed if I was on the phone, shushing her. Helen's voice broke. Now, the silence in our house is so loud. It's a physical thing. It sits in every room. I would give anything in this world, to hear one wrong note, one clumsy scale, just one more time. She wasn't just describing a memory. She was describing a ghost. The ghost of a sound that used to mean life, and now only meant loss. And then it was David Miller's turn. The big man, the retired firefighter who had carried people out of burning buildings, stood up. But he didn't have a speech. He looked over at the defense table, at Jason, and then his eyes went back to the judge. The anger, the grief, it was all too big for words. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small, plastic card. It was burned and melted around the edges. He held it up for the judge to see. It was Chloe's student ID. The photo was singed, but you could still make out her face. Her smile. This wasn't just a card. This was what was left of his daughter. It was found at the crash site, in the wreckage of the car. He didn't say a single word. He just stood there, holding this tiny, charred testament to a life erased, his hand shaking. The silence in that room was heavier, more powerful, than any speech could ever be. And in that silence, something happened. As David Miller stood there, radiating a pain so profound it hurt to look at him, Jason Thorne shifted. He let out a slow, quiet breath. It wasn't a sigh of sadness. It was a sigh of boredom, of impatience. And then, he did the one thing you should never, ever do in a room full of people witnessing a father's heartbreak. He rolled his eyes. Just a fraction. A quick, dismissive flicker towards the ceiling. It was fast. Most people might have missed it. But the judge didn't. David Miller saw it. And in that moment, the entire tone of the room changed. This was no longer just about a car crash. This was becoming about something else entirely. Something much, much colder. After the weight of David Miller's silence, after the ghost of that burned student ID card had settled over the entire courtroom, it was the defense's turn to speak. And let me tell you, it was like watching someone try to sweep back the ocean with a broom. Jason's lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mr. Sterling, stood up. He adjusted his $1,000 tie and launched into his plea. His voice was smooth, practiced, like a well-rehearsed sermon. He talked about a promising young life, but he was talking about Jason's. He mentioned Jason's acceptance into a prestigious business school, his good grades, his bright future. He kept using the word accident. A tragic accident. A momentary lapse. He painted a picture of a good kid from a good family who'd made one single, isolated mistake. Every word felt like a careful, deliberate attempt to minimize what had happened. To shrink Chloe's death down to a simple oops on Jason's otherwise perfect resume. He was building a case not for why Jason was remorseful, but for why he was too valuable to punish properly. It was a calculus of human worth, and in his math, a living, breathing business major was worth more than a dead veterinarian. And then came the moment everyone was waiting for. The judge looked at Jason. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice neutral. "The court will now hear from you. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" This was it. The moment for a real, raw, human apology. The moment for a single tear, a cracking voice, something that showed the shell of the arrogant boy we'd all seen was cracking to reveal something resembling a conscience. Jason stood up. He straightened his suit jacket. And he pulled a small, crisp note card from his pocket. He hadn't even bothered to memorize it. He started to read. His voice was a monotone. A flat, emotionless drone. "I would like to express my deep regret for the events of October 12th, he read, his eyes glued to the card. "I understand that my actions have caused the Miller family a great deal of pain, and for that, I am truly sorry." The words were right. The words were perfect, in fact. But they were empty. They had no soul. They were like reading from a textbook. He was sorry for the events. He was sorry for my actions. He wasn't saying he was sorry for killing Chloe. He was sorry for the inconvenience of it all. And through it all, he never once looked up. He never once turned his head to face David and Helen Miller. He didn't see Helen's tears. He didn't see David's white-knuckled fists. He was reading a script to the judge, and the judge alone, because the judge was the only one in the room who held the key to his cage. He finished. "Thank you, Your Honor." He sat down, neatly tucking the note card back into his pocket. Task completed. The judge didn't move for a long moment. He just stared at the space where Jason had been standing. You could feel the disappointment, the cold fury, rolling off the bench. "Mr. Thorne," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. That was addressed to the court. "Do you have anything you wish to say directly to the Miller family?" The room held its breath. This was the final chance. The unscripted moment. The human moment. Jason glanced at his lawyer, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No. Don't deviate from the plan." Jason looked back at the judge, his face a blank mask. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I do not." And in that moment, any lingering doubt about who this boy really was simply vanished. So there it was. The final word. No. After all the pain, after the memories of a lost daughter, after a father's silent, shattered plea, there was nothing. No remorse. No humanity. Just a cold, empty space where a boy's conscience should have been. You could feel the hope leave the room. It just drained out, like air from a punctured balloon. For the Millers, it was the ultimate confirmation. Their daughter's life, her future, her very memory, meant nothing to the person who had taken it. Helen Miller seemed to shrink in her seat, as if that single word had physically struck her. David just stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone, but you could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. The fight had gone out of him. This was worse than losing. Judge Bennett's face was unreadable. He let the silence hang there for a long, heavy moment. He looked down at the legal pad in front of him, then back up at Jason. He picked up his gavel. That simple, wooden hammer. The sound it would make would end this. It would seal a verdict, but it would not provide justice. Not really. He began to speak, his voice formal and final. Based on the statutes of this state, and the guidelines set forth for the charges of which you have been convicted, he outlined the sentence. 5 to 10 years in a state penitentiary, with the possibility of parole in 5 for good behavior. 5 years. For a lifetime. It was a standard sentence. A predictable one. The kind of sentence a young, privileged first-time offender could expect. Jason's lawyer gave a slight, satisfied nod. They had gotten what they came for. A reduced sentence. A manageable chunk of time. Jason would be out before he was 30. His bright future was merely on pause. And as the judge spoke those numbers, 5 to 10 years, something shifted in Jason Thorne's posture. The tension that had been in his shoulders melted away. A slow, deep breath escaped his lips. It wasn't a sigh of relief. It was a sigh of victory. The judge raised the gavel, ready to bring it down. Crack. And it would be over. But he never got the chance. Because as the gavel was in mid-air, Jason turned his head. Just slightly. Not to the judge. Not to his lawyer. He turned it toward the Miller family. And on his face, for a split second that was somehow an eternity, was a smirk. It wasn't a full smile. It was a tiny, contemptuous twisting at the corner of his mouth. A flash of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was a look that said, "Is that all? I won." It was the most expensive expression he would ever make. Helen Miller saw it. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. David Miller saw it. The stone mask on his face shattered into a look of pure, raw fury. And Judge Harold Bennett saw it. His eyes, which had been full of weary resignation, snapped wide open. The gavel, poised to fall, froze in his hand. The sound that filled the courtroom wasn't the crack of wood. It was the sound of justice, shifting its weight. Have you ever seen a moment that changes everything? Not with a bang, not with a scream, but with a single, silent look? That's what happened in that courtroom. The smirk was there and then it was gone. It lasted less than a second. But in that second, it traveled across the room like a shock wave. It hit Helen Miller first. She didn't make a sound, but her whole body flinched as if she'd been slapped. Her hand, the one that had held the photo of her daughter, flew up and pressed hard against her lips, trapping a gasp inside. Her eyes, already red and raw from crying, went wide with a fresh, new horror. It was one thing to be ignored. It was another thing entirely to be mocked in your deepest grief. It hit David Miller next. The big man, who had held his composure through the charred ID card, through the hollow apology, finally broke. You could see it happen. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, went rigid. His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into two white-knuckled fists. The look on his face wasn't just anger anymore. It was a kind of righteous, volcanic fury. He stared at the back of Jason's head as if he could burn a hole through it with his eyes alone. The shock wave rippled out. A juror, a woman in a blue dress, saw it. She physically recoiled, turning her face away in disgust. The prosecutor's mouth fell slightly open. He looked from Jason to the judge, his mind clearly racing. Even Jason's own lawyer saw it, and a flash of pure panic crossed his face. He knew. He knew this was the one thing you could never, ever do. And finally, the shockwave reached the bench. Judge Harold Bennett did not move. The gavel was still frozen in his upraised hand. But his face underwent a terrifying transformation. The weary resignation was gone. The practiced neutrality was gone. It was stripped away, like a mask being torn off, revealing something cold and hard and furious beneath. His eyes, usually sharp and intelligent, became something else. They became piercing. They locked onto Jason Thorne with an intensity that could have bent steel. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. He just stared, taking in every detail of this young man who had, in a single contemptuous flicker of a facial muscle, spat on the entire proceeding. The air in the room was so still, so heavy, you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. No one coughed. No one shuffled their feet. It was the silence before the avalanche. The point of no return had been crossed. And it wasn't crossed with a word, or a shout, or the crash of a gavel. It was crossed with a smirk. The most expensive smirk in the history of that town. The gavel didn't fall. It just hung there, in the judge's hand, suspended in mid-air. 5 inches of polished wood that held the power to end this, to make that smirk the final official word. But it didn't come down. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. Then it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. You could feel the panic start to bubble up from the defense table. Jason's lawyer, Mr. Sterling, shifted in his seat, his eyes darting from his client to the judge and back again. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet, and he had no idea what was causing the earthquake. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke. His voice was low. Not a roar, but a whisper that somehow cut through the room more sharply than any shout. Mr. Thorne. The words were like 2 chips of ice. Jason, who had been looking down at the table, his momentary triumph already fading into confusion, slowly lifted his head. His eyes met the judge's. And for the first time that day, maybe for the first time in his entire life, Jason Thorne looked afraid. "Would you care to explain," the judge continued, his voice still lethally calm, "the expression you just directed at the victims of your crime?" A jolt went through the room. He'd seen it. He'd seen it all. Mr. Sterling was on his feet in an instant. "Your Honor, I object." The sentence was being imposed. "This is highly irregular." The judge didn't even look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Jason, his hand still holding the gavel aloft. He simply raised his other hand, palm out, toward the lawyer. It wasn't a gesture of greeting. It was a command. A universal sign for stop. Not another word. The lawyer, stunned, sank back into his chair, his legal playbook useless against this raw, human judgment. The judge's focus returned to Jason. "I asked you a question, young man." That smile. What was its meaning? Jason's face was pale. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked like a deer caught in headlights, finally understanding that the bright lights meant impact, not admiration. He fumbled for words, his arrogance completely evaporated, leaving only a hollow, panicked boy. It was nothing, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I was just relieved." "Relieved," the judge repeated, letting the word hang in the air, tasting its bitterness. "The Millers got what they wanted, is that it? They got their 5 to 10 years of your life, and you got to keep the rest? That was the cause for your relief." Jason just stared, trapped. He couldn't confirm it. He couldn't deny it. Judge Bennett's eyes narrowed. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the gavel. But he didn't bring it down. He set it gently, quietly, on its sound block. The act was more terrifying than any crash could have been. "The court," he said, his voice rising for the first time, filling the room with its authority, "has just witnessed your true character. Not in a prepared statement. Not in your attorney's clever words. But in an unguarded, contemptuous, and cruel moment of triumph over a family you have destroyed. He leaned forward, his large frame looming over the bench. This tells me that the sentence I was about to impose is utterly insufficient. It tells me that you have learned nothing, that you feel no remorse, that you see yourself not as a convicted criminal, but as a victor in some twisted game. He paused, letting the magnitude of his words sink in for everyone. This court is now in recess, he declared. I am vacating the proposed sentence. I will recall this court in 1 hour. During that time, I will reconsider the appropriate punishment for a young man who not only took a life, but who would then dare to mock the grave. He stood up, his robes swirling around him. The bailiff, stunned, barely managed to call out, "All rise!" But nobody was looking at the judge as he exited. Every single eye in that courtroom was fixed on Jason Thorne, whose face had gone from pale to a sickly, ghostly white. He finally understood. The gavel hadn't fallen, but his world had just shattered. That 1 hour felt like a lifetime. The courtroom had emptied, then refilled, but the air was different now. It was electric. It was tense. Before, people were here to see an ending. Now, they were here to see a reckoning. When Judge Bennett walked back in, he didn't have the weary look of a man finishing a long day. He had the focused, resolved look of a man who had made up his mind. He didn't sit down. He stood at the bench, his hands gripping the edge of the wood, and he looked directly at Jason Thorne. Jason was visibly shaking, his lawyer beside him, pale and defeated. The game was over, and they both knew it. "Mr. Thorne," the judge began, his voice low and clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "Stand up." Jason shakily got to his feet. "For the past hour, I have been in my chambers," the judge said. "Not reviewing legal precedents. Not studying sentencing guidelines. I was thinking about character, about remorse, and about the profound difference between a mistake and a choice." He let that hang in the air for a moment. A mistake is getting behind the wheel after you've had a drink. A tragic, reckless, unforgivable mistake. But a choice. The judge's voice sharpened. A choice is what you did in this courtroom today. A choice to look at a grieving mother and father, to see the bottomless pain you caused them, and to respond not with shame, not with sorrow, but with a smirk. A choice to reveal the utter contempt you hold in your heart for them, for this process, and for the very concept of justice. He leaned forward, his gaze pinning Jason to the spot. "Your attorney spoke eloquently about your potential, your good grades, your bright future. But I am here to tell you today that potential is worthless. It is absolutely meaningless, without character, without a moral compass. You have shown this court you have none. You are a smart, capable, empty vessel." Jason flinched as if each word was a physical blow. This was not a lapse in judgment. That implies a temporary departure from who you are. What we saw today is who you are. It was your truth, finally leaking out. And that truth is this: you believe you are better than them. You believe your future is more valuable than Chloe Miller's past, present, and future. You believe the rules, for you, are merely suggestions. The judge's voice began to rise, filling the room with a thunderous authority. "Well, let me be perfectly clear. They are not. In this courtroom, there is one rule, one law that stands above all others. And that is the demand for basic human decency. You have violated that law openly and brazenly. You have shown zero capacity for rehabilitation because you see nothing in yourself that needs to be fixed." He took a deep breath, the sound echoing in the microphone. The original sentence was based on the fiction of a remorseful young man. That young man does not exist. He is a phantom, created by your attorney on a note card. The person standing before me now is a remorseless young man who views a human life as a minor obstacle on his path to success. What would you have done if you were the judge? Would you have let the original sentence stand, or would you have done exactly what Judge Bennett is about to do? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. "The court finds you in contempt," the judge declared, his voice final and absolute. "Not just a legal contempt, but a moral one. And for that, the original sentence is not only insufficient, it is an insult to the memory of Chloe Miller and an insult to this court. He straightened up, his eyes blazing. Therefore, the sentence of 5 to 10 years is hereby vacated. It is null and void. The gasp that went through the room was collective. Jason swayed on his feet. Vacated. Thrown out. As if it had never happened. The court, Judge Bennett said, will now proceed to deliver a sentence that reflects the full measure of your crime. Not just the crime of taking a life, but the crime of having no soul. He hadn't even announced the new sentence yet, and it already felt like a life term. The lesson in consequences had begun. And the first consequence was the total and utter obliteration of Jason Thorne's hope. Chaos. Pure, undiluted chaos. That's what followed the judge's words. The moment he said vacated and null and void, it was like someone had set off a bomb in the middle of that orderly courtroom. The loudest sound wasn't a gasp. It was the screech of a chair as Mr. Sterling, Jason's lawyer, shot to his feet. His face was a thundercloud of fury and panic. Your Honor, this is unprecedented. You can't do this. The sentence was being imposed. This violates my client's rights. This is double jeopardy. He was throwing every legal term he could think of at the judge, a desperate Hail Mary to stop the avalanche that had already started. But Judge Bennett didn't even flinch. He looked down at the lawyer, his expression one of utter boredom, as if he were watching a mildly interesting insect. Mr. Sterling, the judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the lawyer's tirade. The sentence was not formally imposed. The gavel did not fall. I retained jurisdiction, and I have the absolute discretion to reconsider a sentence until the very moment it is finalized. Your objection is noted and overruled. He said it with such finality that it sucked all the air out of Sterling's sails. The lawyer stood there, mouth opening and closing, with nothing left to say. The law, it turned out, was on the judge's side. The plan had failed. The system they thought they could manipulate had just been wielded by a master. While this was happening, Jason Thorne completely fell apart. The pale, shaky boy from moments before was gone, replaced by a terrified child. His breath started coming in short, ragged hitches. He turned to his lawyer, his eyes wide with pure animal fear. He can't do this. Can he, Dad? He can't do this, right? He was looking toward his father in the gallery, a man whose money and influence had just proven to be utterly worthless. Across the aisle, the Millers were frozen. They weren't celebrating. They were in shock. David Miller had his arm around Helen, holding her tight, as if they were bracing against a storm. They had come here for closure, expecting a bitter, unsatisfying end. Now, the entire proceeding had been blown wide open. There was no relief on their faces yet, just a profound, cautious disbelief. The ground had been cut from under everyone. This court is in recess for 1 hour, Judge Bennett announced, his voice restoring a brittle order to the room. I suggest the defense use that time to prepare their client for the new reality. And with that, he stood and left the bench. The scene in the hallway was a study in opposites. The Thornes huddled together, Jason, his parents, his lawyer, a tight knot of whispered panic and despair. Jason's mother was sobbing. His father was on his phone, his voice low and furious, probably trying to find some higher authority to call, someone who could stop this. A few yards away, the Millers stood alone. They didn't speak. Helen leaned her head against David's shoulder. They just stared at the wall, processing. The empty chair was still there, in the courtroom. But for the first time, it felt like someone was finally, truly acknowledging its weight. And in his chambers, Judge Bennett wasn't panicking. He was calm. He sat at his desk, surrounded by law books, but he wasn't reading them. He was simply staring out the window at the town he was sworn to protect. He wasn't wondering if he was right. He was calculating the precise weight of the lesson that needed to be learned. The new calculus wasn't about legal statutes anymore. It was about justice. And he was ready to do the math. That hour-long recess was the longest of their lives. When the bailiff opened the doors and people began to file back into the courtroom, it felt different. It wasn't a crowd anymore. It was an audience for a verdict. It was a gathering for a funeral. A funeral for a future. No one spoke. The only sounds were the shuffling of feet, the soft thud of the door closing, and the creak of the old wooden benches as people took their seats. It was the quietest that room had ever been, quieter even than when David Miller held up his daughter's burned ID. The Thorns looked destroyed. Jason's mother had wiped her tears, but her face was a blotchy, broken mask. His father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. Their money, their status, their entire world, it had all evaporated in that 1 hour. They were just parents about to watch their son be taken away for a very, very long time. And Jason was a ghost. He was slumped in his chair next to his lawyer, his shoulders curled inward, trying to make himself small. The arrogance, the smirking confidence, it was all gone, scrubbed away by pure, undiluted terror. His hands were clasped together on the table to stop them from shaking, but it wasn't working. He was staring at the grain of the wood as if he could read his fate in it. The Millers took their seats. Helen reached over and, for the first time, she didn't hold the empty space where her daughter should be. She held her husband's hand. Their grips were tight. They were anchors for each other in a sea of unbearable tension. Then, the door behind the bench opened. Judge Bennett walked in. He didn't march. He didn't stride. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that was more intimidating than any show of anger could ever be. He was carrying a few sheets of paper. His notes. His verdict. His sentence. The bailiff's "All rise" was almost a whisper, as if he too was afraid to break the silence. Everyone stood. The sound of people rising was a rustling wave that then fell into absolute stillness. Judge Bennett took his seat. He placed the papers neatly in front of him. He adjusted his glasses. He took his time, making it clear that every single second in this room now belonged to him. His eyes swept over the gallery, over the broken Thorns, over the waiting Millers, and finally, they came to rest on the defendant. Jason Thorn seemed to feel the weight of that gaze. He slowly, painfully, lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and wide with fear. The judge's voice, when he finally spoke, was clear, cold, and carried no emotion whatsoever. It was the voice of the law itself. "Jason Thorn," he said, "please stand." This was it. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Jason Thorn stood up. It was a shaky, unsteady movement, like a marionette with its strings cut. He had to put a hand on the table to steady himself. He looked smaller now. The expensive suit hung off him, suddenly looking like a costume he was no longer entitled to wear. All eyes were on him, but he only had eyes for the judge. He was waiting for the blow to fall. Judge Bennett picked up the papers. He didn't read from them immediately. He looked directly at Jason, and his voice was not loud, but it was absolute. "The State v. Jason Thorn," he began. A case that, on its surface, was about reckless driving, vehicular manslaughter, the tragic end of a promising young life. But this court has learned it is about something far more fundamental. It is about the value of a human being. It is about the currency of remorse. And it is about the consequences of a corrupt soul. He set the papers down. He didn't need them. The original sentence of 5 to 10 years was calculated based on the facts of the crime alone. It was a mathematical equation. But justice is not math. Justice is moral. It is proportional. And it must account for the character of the person being sentenced. He leaned forward, his voice dropping, forcing everyone in the room to lean in to listen. "You, Jason Thorn, have demonstrated a character devoid of empathy, brimming with contempt, and bankrupt of conscience. You were given every opportunity to show a shred of human decency. A single, genuine tear. A moment of unscripted apology. Instead, you gave this court a smirk. You looked into the abyss of a family's grief and you smiled." He paused, letting the memory of that smirk haunt the room once more. That smirk was not a crime of passion. It was not a reckless act. It was a cold, calculated, and deliberate expression of who you are at your core. It told me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you are a danger not because of your driving, but because of your humanity, or your profound lack of it. Jason began to cry. Silent, helpless tears streamed down his face. But it was too late. These weren't tears for Chloe Miller. They were tears for himself. The judge saw the difference. Therefore, Judge Bennett's voice rose, filling the room with its finality, a sentence based on the fiction of your remorse is an insult to justice. This court must now sentence the real Jason Thorne, the one who smirked. He picked up the paper again, his eyes locking onto Jason's. On the charges of which you have been convicted, this court sentences you to a term of no less than 10 years, and no more than 20 years, in a state penitentiary. A sharp, collective intake of breath. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice ironclad, you will be required to serve a minimum of 10 full years before the parole board will so much as consider your case. Let me be perfectly clear. There will be no good behavior outs. There will be no early release. You will serve a decade, day for day, in a cell. You will have 10 years to contemplate the meaning of that smirk. The numbers hung in the air. 10 to 20. A minimum of 10 years. It was double the original sentence. It was a lifetime for an 18-year-old. The reaction was instantaneous. Jason made a sound, a choked, guttural gasp, like the air had been kicked out of him. His legs buckled. The bailiff, who had been standing close, stepped forward and caught him by the arm, holding him upright. From the gallery, a wail erupted. It was Jason's mother. She collapsed against her husband. Her cries of "No! No, please!" echoing in the stunned silence. David Miller didn't cheer. He didn't smile. He let out a long, slow breath, a breath he felt like he'd been holding for a year. He looked at his wife, Helen, and she gave a single, small, tearful nod. It wasn't joy. It was closure. It was a grim, painful, but necessary acknowledgement that the scale of justice had finally, truly, been balanced. Judge Bennett picked up his gavel. This court is adjourned. Crack. The sound was as sharp and as final as a gunshot. The sound of the gavel didn't just mark an end. It set things in motion. It was a starting pistol for a whole new kind of nightmare. For Jason Thorne, that sound was the last sound of his old life. The moment it cracked, the strength went out of his legs completely. The bailiff's grip on his arm was no longer supportive, it was restrictive. He was no longer a defendant. He was a prisoner. "Please, no," Jason whimpered, the words barely audible, meant for no one but himself. He was crying openly now, tears of pure, childish terror. This wasn't the calculated performance from before. This was real. And it was too late. As the judge stood and swept out of the room without a backward glance, 2 more bailiffs moved in. They were calm, professional, and utterly impersonal. They took Jason by his other arm. There was a quiet, metallic click that was somehow louder than the gavel had been. The cold, hard feel of handcuffs around his wrists. Jason's mother screamed, a raw, primal sound of loss that mirrored the one Helen Miller had surely made a year ago. She lunged forward, but her husband held her back, his own face ashen, his body rigid with a shock so profound it looked like a physical illness. But on the other side of the aisle, there was no scream. There was no cheer. David and Helen Miller simply watched. They watched as the boy who killed their daughter was led, stumbling and sobbing, toward the side door of the courtroom, the door that didn't lead back to the free world. They watched as his expensive suit jacket wrinkled in the bailiff's firm grips. They watched as he disappeared through the doorway, the sound of his crying cut off as the heavy door swung shut with a solid, definitive thud. That was the second sound of justice. Not the crack of the gavel, but the soft, final thud of a door closing. David Miller finally looked away from the door. He turned to his wife. He saw the tears on her cheeks, but he also saw something else. A release. A slight, almost imperceptible loosening of the tension that had held her face in a permanent state of pain for a year. She wasn't happy. How could she be? But the terrible, grinding agony of the trial, the insult of the smirk, the weight of the injustice, it was over. He squeezed her hand. They stood up together. They didn't look at the thorns. They didn't say a word to anyone. They just turned and walked out of the courtroom, into the hallway, and toward a future that, for the first time since Chloe died, was finally theirs again. It was a future built on a foundation of grief, yes, but the furious storm of the trial had passed. The courtroom was left empty, save for the lingering echo of a mother's wail and the ghost of a smirk that had just cost a boy a decade of his life. A verdict like that, it doesn't just end in the courtroom. It ripples out, like a stone dropped into the still pond of a small town, touching everything and everyone. In Oak Creek, the news spread faster than the fire David Miller used to fight. It was on the local news, of course. But it was also in the grocery store aisles, at the gas pumps, and over kitchen tables. The town was divided, but not evenly. There was a grim sense of satisfaction for most. At the diner, you'd hear people say, "Finally, a judge with some backbone." Or, "That Thorne boy thought he was above it all." Not anymore. The smirk had been the talk of the town, and Judge Bennett's response felt like a collective punch in the gut to every bully who'd ever gotten away with something. But there were whispers, too. From the more insulated, wealthy side of town, where the Thornes had their friends. "It was too harsh," they'd murmur. "It was just a boy being a boy." But even those whispers were quiet, half-hearted. The sheer, naked cruelty of that smirk had been a bridge too far. It was hard to defend the indefensible. For the Millers, the world was quieter. The circus was over. The microphones were gone. They could finally just grieve. A week after the sentencing, they visited Chloe's grave. They didn't bring the anger with them this time. They just brought flowers. David placed a small, smooth stone he'd found on one of their old hiking trips on her headstone. It was a tradition they had. It was a piece of their old life, a life with her in it. For the first time, it felt like they were visiting their daughter, not just mourning her killer. Helen started spending time at the animal shelter where Chloe had volunteered. She didn't work with the animals. She couldn't bear to. But she started organizing their fundraising drives, using her daughter's name to do good. It was a way to keep Chloe's light flickering in the world, a small, defiant act against the darkness that had taken her. And Jason Thorne? His new life began with a bang. Not a gavel, but the heavy, metallic clang of a cell door. The state penitentiary was a universe away from his curated suburban life. The orange jumpsuit he was issued was the first thing he'd ever worn that wasn't chosen for style or status. It was chosen for utility. For containment. His first night, he lay on a thin, plastic-coated mattress, listening to a symphony of terrifying sounds, shouts, curses, the echo of footsteps in the cavernous cell block. The air smelled of bleach and sweat and despair. The arrogance that had been his armor was stripped away, leaving only raw, shivering fear. He was no longer Jason Thorne, promising young man. He was inmate number 789234. And the 10 long years that stretched out before him felt like an eternity. The smirk was gone, replaced by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of a boy who had finally, truly, run out of second chances. The Thornes, within a month, put their sprawling house on the market. The for sale sign was a white flag of surrender to the town's judgment. They were gone before the leaves finished turning, leaving behind a community that had once respected them, and a legacy now permanently stained by their son's contempt and the crushing weight of the justice it invited. A year passed. The sharp, jagged edges of their grief had slowly begun to soften. Not heal, a loss like that never truly heals, but the pain became something they could carry, instead of something that carried them. The scholarship in Chloe's name had its first recipient, a bright girl who wanted to be a vet. It was a good day. A quiet light in the darkness. It was on an afternoon like any other that the mail came. Helen was sorting through it at the kitchen table. Bills, a magazine, a flyer for a new pizza place. And then, a plain, white envelope. No return address. But the postmark was from the state penitentiary. Her hands froze. The world seemed to narrow to that single piece of paper. Her heart, which had learned to beat steadily again, began to hammer against her ribs. She held the envelope by its corner, as if it were something dangerous, something that could burn her. She didn't open it. Not right away. She carried it with her, setting it on the counter, then moving it to the mantelpiece, as if trying to find a place where it looked less threatening. It sat there for hours, a silent white bomb in their peaceful living room. When David came home, he saw it immediately. He saw the look on Helen's face. He didn't have to ask. He just walked over, put his arm around her, and together they stared at the envelope. "We don't have to open it," he said, his voice low. Helen shook her head. "Yes," she whispered. "We do." With trembling fingers, she carefully slit the top of the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the kind from a cheap notepad. The handwriting was messy, uneven. Not the polished script of a note card. This was scrawled. She read it. Her eyes moved over the words once, then again. She didn't speak. She just handed the paper to David. He took it, expecting, he didn't know what. A plea for forgiveness? An excuse? A list of his sufferings? It was none of those things. There were no long paragraphs. No explanations. Just 2 sentences, standing alone in the middle of the page. "I am sorry for your daughter. And I am sorry for the boy I was in your courtroom." David read it aloud, his voice rough with emotion. The words were simple, but they were real. For the first time, there were no lawyers, no strategies, no parents, no audience. It was just a voice from a cell, finally speaking a terrible, painful truth. It wasn't an absolution. It didn't bring Chloe back. But it was the first genuine thing Jason Thorne had ever given them. It was an acknowledgement, not just of their pain, but of his own monstrousness. And in the heavy silence of their living room, for the Millers, that meant something. The letter didn't change the past. It couldn't. Chloe was still gone. The empty chair was still empty. The memory of that smirk in the courtroom, that would be burned into their minds forever. But the letter did change the silence in their house. It was no longer the loud, screaming silence of injustice. It wasn't the tense, waiting silence for an apology that never came. This was a different silence. A heavier, but somehow softer, quiet. It was the silence of a story that had, at long last, reached its final painful period. David and Helen didn't talk about it much. What was there to say? They sat together in their living room, the letter resting on the coffee table between them like an artifact from another world. "It doesn't change anything," David said finally, his voice low and gruff. Helen looked at him, her eyes clear. "I know," she replied softly. "But it changes the air." And it did. For a year, their grief had been tangled up with rage, with the bitter poison of being mocked. Now, that particular poison had been drawn. The anger, which had been a fire keeping them warm in the worst of their grief, had finally burned out. And what was left was just the loss. Pure and simple and terrible. David picked up the letter. He didn't crumple it. He didn't tear it up. He walked over to a small wooden chest on the bookshelf, the box where they kept Chloe's things. Her favorite hair ribbon. Her graduation tassel. The burned student ID. He opened the lid. The faint scent of her perfume, still clinging to a scarf, whispered out. He placed the single sheet of lined paper inside, on top of everything else. It wasn't forgiveness. It was filing. It was placing the final piece of the tragedy where it belonged, in the past, with their daughter. He closed the lid. The click of the latch was soft, but final. Helen watched him, and then she looked out the window at the setting sun. The fight was over. The battle for a shred of human recognition from their daughter's killer was won. Now, all that was left was to remember the music, and learn to live with the quiet. So, what was it all for? A life lost. A family shattered. A boy's future buried in a prison cell. What remains when the courtroom empties and the headlines fade? The legacy of Chloe Miller isn't the tragedy. It's the light. The scholarship fund her parents started grew. It didn't just send one girl to college. It sent 3, then 5. Every year, another student with a dream of healing animals gets a chance, all because of a girl who had that same dream. Her name became synonymous with kindness, not loss. Her brief life became a foundation for other futures. That's how David and Helen chose to remember their daughter. Not as a victim, but as a force for good. And Judge Harold Bennett? He never spoke of the case again. But when he retired a few years later, a young reporter asked him what justice meant to him. He thought for a long moment and said, "Justice isn't just about the law. The law is the frame. Justice is the picture inside. It's my job to make sure the picture is true." Everyone in Oak Creek knew which picture he was talking about. His legacy was a reminder that the law has a soul, and that soul demands accountability, not just procedure. As for Jason Thorne, his legacy was a lesson. He served his 10 years. The boy who went in, arrogant and empty, did not come out. A man came out, quiet, hollowed out by a decade of reflection. He disappeared into another state, another life. He would forever be the boy who smirked. His legacy was a warning, told in whispers, that a single cruel, unforced error can cost you everything. That character isn't a luxury. It's the foundation of your entire life. The story of Oak Creek, of the Millers and Jason Thorne and Judge Bennett, became a part of the town's fabric. It wasn't a story they told with joy, but with a grim respect. It was a story about the cost of a life, the price of arrogance, and the slow, heavy, but unwavering hand of justice. It reminds us that before anything else, before grades, before money, before potential, we must be human. Because the world can forgive a mistake, but it will never forget a smirk in the face of suffering. If this story made you question what true justice really looks like, subscribe for more. Next week, we're telling the story of a woman who found a stranger living in her walls for years, and the even darker secret he was hiding. You won't want to miss it.